Most artists carry it quietly for years and never say it in public. That one performance they would erase if they could. David Phelps named his directly, and what he named was not a stumble from before he found his footing, not a small regional concert with a thin crowd in a difficult room, but a night on one of gospel music's most watched stages, in front of a capacity crowd that left the arena completely satisfied. What that crowd never saw was what he carried off stage when the applause faded. What it took him years to name was the part that changed how he understood everything that came before it. That admission, and the faith framework he eventually built around it, tells us something about the man behind the voice that the voice alone never could. Stay with this story, because the moment we reach together changes how every previous season of his career sounds, and it is worth the journey. David Wayne Phelps grew up in Tomball, Texas, inside a Christian faith tradition where singing was a spiritual discipline practiced with the full self, not a performance skill to be measured and applauded. His training at Baylor University shaped a tenor voice that sits in a category by itself within Southern gospel music. And when Bill Gaither extended an invitation to join the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997, the answer David gave changed the character of Christian music for 2 full decades. The career that followed is the one his audience knows deeply and well. The recordings, the homecoming concerts, the television specials built around the Gaither ministry, and the moments, and there were many of them, when his voice did something on a stage that caused several thousand people to simultaneously stop breathing and not quite know what to do with themselves once the note resolved. His recording of End of the Beginning reshaped how countless listeners understood resurrection and what it means to hold belief in something eternal. His delivery of Via Dolorosa, the song tracing Christ's walk toward Calvary, produced a quality of silence in auditoriums that differs from ordinary quiet, the kind that arrives when people are genuinely stopped mid-breath and cannot move until the last note resolves itself in the room. For the millions who built their faith lives alongside the Gaither Homecoming video series through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, David was not simply a featured voice in a singing group. He was woven into the soundtrack of their most personal spiritual memories. Families played his recordings at funerals. Couples associate his voice with the years they spent raising children inside the church. People will tell you without embarrassment that something David sang at a specific moment gave them something they had been searching for and could not name on their own. That is the relationship his audience carries into every room where he performs, and understanding the full weight of it is the only way to understand why the night he named as his greatest regret carries the meaning it does. The Gaither Homecoming concerts reached their widest cultural reach somewhere in the early 2000s, filling arenas across the country with audiences drawn by nostalgia, genuine faith, and an extraordinary collection of voices Gaither had gathered across 30 years of Christian ministry. People planned travel around those evenings, drove several hours, and brought family members who needed the specific kind of testimony that Southern gospel music delivers with its particular combination of joy and weight. David stood at the center of those nights, alongside Guy Penrod, Mark Lowry, and others who defined what those concerts sounded like at their most powerful. The pressure attached to that position was real, even when most fans never framed it that way. When thousands of people arrive expecting a specific thing from a specific tenor, when the anticipation in that room rests entirely on notes that only one person in the building can reliably reach, the singer holding that expectation carries something that does not dissolve when the music starts. The years between 2002 and 2004 stretched in ways that went well beyond any single touring schedule. David was balancing Gaither commitments with the demands of his marriage to Lori and the work of raising their children, navigating the specific difficulty of a life that looks extraordinary from the outside and is simply exhausting to actually live through, regardless of the blessings it contains. Voices under sustained pressure do not always announce their limits in advance. Sometimes the limit arrives mid-performance, mid-note, without warning, and the singer has to decide in a fraction of a second what happens next. That decision sits at the center of the story David eventually chose to tell, and how he came to understand it is where this account takes a turn nobody in his circle expected him to make public. Partway through his featured number at one of those homecoming arena concerts, something went wrong in a section of the song that required everything he had. With thousands of people watching, he chose to push through rather than stop, chose to protect what the audience believed about him rather than trust them with where he actually was. And he came to describe that choice, looking back across the years since, as a form of pride. Not the aggressive kind, not arrogance, but the quieter variety that dresses itself as professionalism and responsibility and concern for people who drove several hours to be in that room. In the moment, he convinced himself that continuing was the right thing to do. The years since told him otherwise, and the distinction he drew between those two positions is the part of this story that makes everything else land differently. What made this a genuine regret, and what separates it from any ordinary account of vocal fatigue, was what David admitted about his interior state during that performance. He was not simply managing a physical challenge in isolation from everything else happening in his life. He was performing faith, singing words about grace and resurrection and the presence of God from a place where the words and the feeling were not fully connected. The notes arrived, the emotion registered on his face, but the interior place that the best gospel singing draws from, the place where the singer is not managing the performance, but actually living inside it, that was not where he stood that night. For an artist whose entire legacy rested on exactly that kind of interior honesty, the distinction mattered in a way no amount of audience response could ever resolve. Bill Gaither built the homecoming world on a direct conviction that authenticity was the only thing that lasted in gospel music. When the original homecoming videos began in 1991 at his home in Alexandria, Indiana, born from a casual reunion that carried no formal production plan, the cameras deliberately caught people mid-conversation, mid-laugh, singing without preparation, responding to each other without choreography. Technique served the song, Bill had long understood, but honesty served the listener, and he had spent decades learning the difference between a performer who executed words and one who actually meant them. What he recognized in David from the beginning was not only the remarkable tenor range, it was the capacity for emotional transparency in performance, the willingness to mean the words, and that recognition is exactly what makes the weight of that concert night land differently when you understand the world it happened inside. The one performance David would take back took place inside the very world built on the conviction that meaning the words was the entire point. And he knew it. The people backstage that evening saw no visible failure. The crowd responded warmly, and David walked off stage having delivered what most people in that arena would have called a strong performance in Christian music. He carried something private home with him that took years to fully surface. His first extended departure from the Gaither vocal band around 2004, described publicly at the time as driven by the desire to be more present for his family, also contained this quieter reckoning, the one building since that concert night about what he was doing, why, and whether the way he had been doing it was serving anyone as honestly as it could. His faith framework for understanding that season reflects something his longtime listeners will recognize immediately. He did not frame the memory as failure in the way the secular world assigns that word. He framed it as instruction, a reminder that the voice he had been given was not his to manage according to audience expectation, but to steward with honesty, including and especially in the moments when honesty required more than a technically polished vocal performance could deliver. Guy Penrod, who shared those homecoming stages with David through many of those years, has spoken broadly about the gap that exists in live performance between what an audience experiences and what the singer is actually carrying. That gap, the one most performers keep private to protect both themselves and the people watching, was exactly what David chose to name, and naming it, he has said, was part of how he eventually came back to the stage differently. When David returned to the Gaither vocal band in 2009, after several years away, people close to that ministry noticed something that did not change the voice, but changed how it was carried. He seemed to offer the music more openly, hold it more lightly, less focused on protecting the performance, and more fully present inside the song itself. And whether that shift traces directly back to the night he has named as his one regret is something only David can answer. But the timing fits, and the arc of it fits. The gospel community that has followed this story across more than 2 decades watches with the kind of affection that comes from a long and honest shared history. The voice is still there. The calling is still there. And the man behind both has grown into someone willing to say the harder things in public, which turns out to be rarer than an extraordinary tenor voice, and, in the long run, considerably more worth knowing about. What his story leaves us with is worth sitting with quietly. The concert he regrets most may have become, in the longer arc of his life and his Christian ministry, one of the nights that mattered most. Not for what happened on that stage, but for what he carried home from it and what he eventually chose to do with it.